you, Alan. Thank you, Josh, for the invitation and for the very kind introduction. I am honored to be with you today because I was born in Wisconsin, grew up in Mississippi, and came of age in Georgia. I went to graduate school in Texas. I made a quick sojourn to Connecticut, but came back south as soon as humanly possible. But I believe I'm an exemplar of why we have to focus not simply on the coastal environments, but think about what's happening across the country. We're in the midst of multiple crises. We know that COVID-19 is ravaging our country, but it's also revealing challenges that so many of us have known for so long. We have a healthcare crisis, a pandemic that has claimed more than nearly 200,000 lives in the United States alone, that is disproportionately affecting communities of color across the country, particularly in the South. We are in the midst of an economic recession, a recession that is exacerbated by inaction and by a tension between what should be done and what must be done and by whom. But we know that this economic recession is devastating the very same communities that are disproportionately affected by the COVID healthcare crisis. And we know that there is systemic injustice that is being revealed and renewed, unfortunately, every day as we watch police accountability issues rise to the fore. But we have to pay attention to the full spectrum of systemic injustice and what that says about who we are as a nation and the future that we have. And of course, there is climate change. The climate change that we are watching play out in real time. The widespread wildfires that are damaging and ravaging the West. The 7 to 8 active hurricane systems in the Atlantic. And of course, just today, the announcement of even more breakage of the Greenland ice cap. We can limit our attention to where we are, or we can attack the catastrophes head on. And the litany of challenges that we face cannot be misrepresented, and they cannot be underestimated. But we also have to understand what precipitated them. These are intentional acts that have come about because of intentional attacks on science and on knowledge. We have watched for 40 years as unfortunately we have seen groups that have done their best to not simply tell us the things that are untrue, but to weaken our faith in science, to weaken our faith in facts. We have watched from the highest levels of government this very false equivalence between propaganda and truth. And this false equivalence, unfortunately, has bled into our educational system, our communications with one another, and unfortunately, our ability to respond to the crises that we face. Because of these challenges, because of this 40-year retrenchment from being a country that led on science, that led on facts, we have seen deeply, deeply consequential challenges arise. We have higher poverty levels, higher levels of inequality. We face healthcare crises that are combined with environmental challenges because air pollutants have run amok. And because unfortunately, even in this administration, we've seen more than 130 attempts to roll back regulations that were protecting our people. We know that communities are facing energy insecurity as we leave one of the hottest summers on record and head into what could be a devastating winter. We know that there has been extreme job loss and extreme weather, and these all have real consequences for the economies of our country, for the people of our country, and for the future of our country. But I'm here today because I know we can address these issues. We can address climate crisis. We can address the economic insecurity, and we can do it together. But what it requires is that we have a broader sense of who has a stake in this challenge and how we can work together to bring this challenge to solution. First and foremost, we have to break the myth that climate progress is bad economics. I served in the state legislature for 11 years. 11 years of arguing about whether climate change was real until I realized that I didn't have to convince people that they agreed with my premise as long as they agreed with our outcomes. And that's why I was very proud during my tenure as leader. I served as Democratic leader for 7 years, and I formed and forged what was called a Green Tea Party Alliance. We were part of groups with the Tea Party and others that were able to move effectively on the issue of climate change, not simply by convincing people that they agreed with us on the issue, but convincing them they agreed with us on the outcome. We were able to block bills that would have attempted to weaken our stream buffer, that would have made it harder for us to protect our communities, because I cared about climate change and they cared about property taxes. And part of our responsibility is to meet people where they are, even if they're not where we want them to be. That means that we have to have legitimate and thoughtful conversations that talk about climate progress, not simply as an end in of itself, but as a way to better economics for our communities. Because as we think about a third way, as we think about what's happening in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Georgia, in Alabama, what's happening across this country, people want better, but they don't know if they can afford it. And it's our responsibility to articulate how we can make it happen without losing what we have. Instead of alienating we have to aggregate allies. We have to think about how we can engender support in the electricity sector, in the building sector, in transportation, and in agriculture. Because if we can have the conversations about how we make things stronger, how we make things better, how we can save our climate and save our people and save our jobs, then that's when we make progress. And I know that we have the potential. I know we have the people, and I know we have the ingenuity. But it's going to require bold action at every level of government. We have to have federal leaders who actually understand what's at stake, but are willing to have conversations when they don't get everything they want the first time around. We have to engage state leaders, especially governors, those who have taken up the climate change crisis and those who've become reticent because they're afraid it can lead to loss of economics. And we have to be willing to have conversations at the municipal and county levels, at the school board levels, because at every level of government, if there are resources to be invested, there are resources to be maintained, and there are ways for us to improve our climate crisis. I created a few organizations when I did not become the governor of Georgia in 2018. One is known as Fair Fight with a focus on voter suppression. A second is Fair Count, working on making sure we have an accurate census. But the third organization I created is called the Southern Economic Advancement Project. SEEP was designed to have the conversation about how we move the South forward. And our first major paper, our first major investigation, was looking into how the South can be involved in climate progress. We have to recognize that all 5 states with the highest energy burdens in the country are located in the South. And we have to understand that these pose real challenges, because often the fossil fuel industry can be upwards of 10% of the state budgets. So it's not simply about saying we have to decarbonize and end use of fossil fuels, because the reality is we're talking about people's jobs, their livelihoods, their access to healthcare, their access to opportunity for their families. But we also have to understand that 58% of African Americans live in the South. 58% of the entire Black population in our country lives in the South. And so when we are fighting climate change, we are also fighting issues of racial injustice. And with growing populations among the Latino and AAPI community, and we can never forget the Native American community, we know that we have to intersect these conversations. But this intersection isn't simply about racial injustice. And again, it goes back to how people make a living and how they make a life. And so with SEEP, I was very proud of our work to talk about how the South can be involved, how the South can be a leader on climate progress, beginning by understanding what the challenges are and understanding that we can't simply elide them and go around them. We have to confront them head on, including, for example, the building sector. Georgia and across the South, we know that the building trades are a vital part of the economy in our region. But that's why we are urging energy efficient investment, making certain that when we are doing things at every level of government, energy efficiency is built into how the building trades do their work and how communities expect work to be done. We have to reduce in-home reliance on fossil fuels by funding investment. We know that in places where local governments have invested in energy opportunities for their homeowners and for their renters, we have seen climate progress. We have to look at building electrification and investing in that too. It is not enough to say it is good if we're not willing to put our money where our mouths are. And it's about strengthening building codes and strengthening zoning so communities aren't overwhelmed by the worst actors, and they have opportunities to see what potential can look like. We also have to look, of course, at the energy industry. We have to look at creating renewable portfolios and clean electricity standards, but we have to make certain that we are understanding the transition that so many southern states, and I would argue southwestern states, have to make to meet these standards. Policies for stranded costs. Sounds a little technical, but I'm talking to the right audience, because we know that as we see reduced financial burdens that are associated with deep decarbonization, we have to make certain that people aren't losing their jobs and their livelihoods on the promise of more. And that means we have to invest not only in building new, but we have to invest in reducing reliance. For example, having a power plant debt refinancing program that allows power plants to transition without losing jobs and without losing access to resources. But we must also think about transportation, particularly for communities of color and for the poor. When we think about climate change, if we think about transportation as a vehicle for climate progress, we actually make everyone's lives better. We can invest in electric vehicle policies, ones like we had here in Georgia that unfortunately were so successful, one party decided they wanted to eliminate them. But we knew those policies were making progress by investing in electric vehicles, by investing in fleets, by making certain that those workers were driving clean vehicles. But we also have to think about expanding public transit. For so many of our communities that face economic insecurity, public transit is a transformational moment. And so we have to stop retrenching or stop retreating on the issue of public transit, and we have to advance. Because it's not about whether public transit turns a profit. It's how it transforms our communities into clean communities where exhaust fumes and pollutants aren't destroying our opportunities and where our community members have the ability to get to where good jobs are. We also have to increase walk and bike mobility, especially in the South that is so deeply reliant on cars. And I know Michigan, you have a similar situation. We have to do the work of ensuring that we encourage walking and bike mobility, not simply in word, but in deed. And in the South in particular, but we know this is true again across the Midwest, we have to think about the agriculture sector. When I was running for governor, I traveled the state of Georgia, all 159 counties, and I spent a lot of time with our farmers, as I had for the previous 11 years that I've been in office. And through SEEP, we've been doing a lot of work with Black farmers, 45,000 of them strong, 90% of whom are in the South. And we know that if we want to see the kind of regenerative agriculture that we need, we've got to provide financial support and tech support. And that means as we look at new administrations at the state and federal level, we have to be intentional about investing in our future by investing in our farmers. We have to explore those regenerative ag practices that actually help improve not only their delivery, but also their processes and their legacy. We have to expand biodiversity in the South and across the country by investing in expanding public lands. And we have to recognize that we must invest in and regulate our coastal systems. Our coastal ecosystems are being ravaged. We luckily saw, I don't want to investigate too much, but we know that there's been a recent moratorium on drilling. And while that is important, it is not enough. I live in the South, but the South has a lot of coastline. And that means we have to think about not simply the East Coast or the West Coast, but we have to think about all of our waterways and all of our communities that are affected, particularly by the extreme weather events that are ravaging the South. Fundamentally, I'm here because I believe in progress. I believe that environmental justice is possible, that climate progress is possible. I believe in the intersectionality of who we are and what we do because I've lived it. As a college student at Spelman, I spent time 2 different summers working first for the Environmental Criterion and Assessment Office of the US EPA, and then working for the newly created Office of Environmental Justice. And I did that work not because I grew up talking about environmental issues. I grew up spending time with my great-grandmother, who we called Mumu, listening to her talk about the land, about the farm that she had grown up on as a sharecropper, and about the tiny little plot that she had created behind her house. I know the legacy of the land and the legacy of our air. I know how important it has been for so many communities to find their way because of the environmental connections that we have. And climate progress is essential if we are going to continue to build a legacy of trust, a legacy of opportunity, and a legacy of progress. Whether you come at this as a scientist, as an activist, as a policymaker, our fundamental obligation is to come at this together, to understand that there is a third way. We don't have to fight, we don't have to give in, but we do have to have our eyes on the very clear prize of climate progress in the immediate moment. And that means voting for leaders who understand us, who are willing to invest and willing to put their political reputations on the line for progress. It's filling out a 2020 census that seems disconnected, but tells the story of who we are and where we are and what we need. And it's about remaining committed and remaining engaged after November, because the work that we must do is not simply about protesting in the streets or protesting at the ballot box, although both are essential. We have to protest through our participation in policymaking and in the future of our country, because we can't afford not to. Thank you so much.